We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Now Apollo, when the world held its breath. A network first report by James Burke.
Ignition sequence start.
Wednesday the 16th of July, 1969. 3 young men lie side by side in a capsule at the top of a giant Saturn V, heading for a rendezvous with history, as Apollo 11 begins its journey to the moon. For millions of people all over the world, it's the first step on our way to the stars. The Apollo program was sold as one of the greatest scientific achievements ever. It wasn't. When I covered it, along with hundreds of other journalists 25 years ago, we all thought it was a perfect example of American high-tech. It wasn't. The huge global audience watching it all on TV believed it couldn't fail. It did. Because Apollo was one of the most difficult and dangerous bits of politics ever attempted, and none of us at the time knew that. So why did they take the risk? Because in 1957, at the height of the Cold War, the Russians shocked the West with the totally unexpected launch of Sputnik.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
Sputnik was a body blow to American complacency and a much-needed boost to Soviet national pride.
To tune in on Sputnik's Beep Beep, sharing the radio enthusiasts' interest in the Soviet satellite.
A month after Sputnik, the Russians did it again.
A dog, a living creature far in outer space for the first time.
For America, the writing was on the wall. Today a dog, tomorrow a warhead.
Means Russia probably has an operational intercontinental ballistic missile.
The American response to the Soviet threat was a public relations disaster.
The risk was very high in the early days, and there were several atlases that we saw that would go several hundred feet into the air. They'd lose guidance. They'd either self-destruct or be destructed by the range safety officer within the Mercury program itself. The 2 of the first 3 launches we had, we lost during powered flight. So this had a very strong effect on us because we knew within a matter of a relatively short period of time we were going to put a man on that guy. The learning curve was incredibly steep in the first few years of spaceflight.
Getting into space proved technically much more complex and ultimately more dangerous than anybody thought. In 1961, the Russians really stunned the world when Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. And then the most famous man on Earth. Russian prestige was at an all-time high. In America, the newly elected President Kennedy, faced with political disasters at home and abroad, desperately needed a major propaganda coup.
We shall make up and move ahead.
His Vice President Lyndon Johnson came up with it. Start a race to the moon and win it.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Tell you the truth, I was frightened to death by that speech. I didn't know what the hell was in front of us. I never thought about the surface of the moon. I never thought about long-range communications at 270,000 miles. I'd never heard of a free return trajectory. I never thought about going away from this planet.
When Kennedy made the speech that we were going to the moon prior to the end of the decade, we were struggling trying to get our first man, Alan Shepard, in space. We had gone through several launch attempts, and we were frustrated that we had been unable to put an American in space. And here, before we had put an American in space, before we had had American in orbit, we heard that we were going to go to the moon. There was no question. It was a heck of a challenge.
The Americans were coming from behind, and the Soviets kept the lead with still more space firsts. Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. In 1965, Alexei Leonov made the first space walk, an essential preparation for any moon flight. The Soviets looked unbeatable.
We began this program before the American colleagues. This experience we will use during our program with landed onto the moon.
When he got back, Leonov started training for a lunar landing. He believed it was his destiny to be the first man on the moon. But it was not to be. In 1967, the Russian program started to fall apart. One of their cosmonauts was killed during an emergency re-entry. Then on 3 successive launch attempts, their newly designed moon rocket exploded. The Soviet missions were grounded, although nobody in the West at the time knew it. The Americans had their own tragedies too. In January 1967, during a pre-launch exercise for the flight of Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee burned to death on the launch pad.
The fire occurred while the astronauts were in the spacecraft at T-minus 10 minutes prior to the planned simulated liftoff.
The Apollo fire that killed the 3 men on the pad was a terrible experience for all of us to go through. That was something that shouldn't have happened, that's something we could have prevented, but something that we had to overcome and something that we had to go forward with. And fortunately, I think we had enough leadership in that time to take those events and make them work for us rather than against us.
Apollo 1 was a disaster, and it proved to be the turning point for the American program because it forced NASA to reevaluate the technology and redouble their efforts. In the next 2 years, they successfully launched and tested all the systems needed for a lunar landing. Only one test remained, to see if they could get there. In December 1968, on board Apollo 8, man left the confines of Earth for the first time, to cross the void and go into orbit around the moon, 250,000 miles away. It was a tremendous risk. The first launch of a fully configured Saturn V, the first time NASA had relied on its deep space communications and tracking network. But the rewards were worth it. The crew of Apollo 8, led by a 42-year-old father of 4, Jim Lovell, became the first human beings to see the far side of the moon.
For the last day on the way to the moon, the blunt end of our spacecraft was pointing towards the moon, so we never saw the moon as it got much bigger. I looked up in the windows and all I saw was black sky. That's all any of us saw until we rotated the spacecraft around about 180 degrees, and there, just 60 miles below, slowly slipping by, were the ancient old craters on the far side of the moon.
Apollo 8, Houston, what does the old moon look like from 60 miles? Over.
Okay, Houston. The moon is essentially gray. No color. Looks like plaster of Paris.
We go through this incredibly long period of loss of signal as the spacecraft went around the backside of the moon. And all of a sudden this guy appears and you feel this tremendous sense of relief. You don't know yet that you're in the proper return trajectory, but you know the spacecraft emerged at about the right time, so you have a gut feeling that says, yeah, our computations were right. Our ability to track is right. We did the right thing.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without
And then
form.
when Borman, Lovell, and Anders started reciting from the book of Genesis, I mean, that not only sent chills, that there took you back almost to the feeling that, hey, we were all there at that time. We were all partners in this grand enterprise. And what a hell of a way to start. I mean, boy, if you really want to start a program going to the moon, that was the ideal mission, and that was the ideal event that sort of focused everything for us as to what this business was all about.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, God bless all of you on the good earth.
Apollo 8 returned successfully to Earth. At last, after the deaths on Apollo 1, the American space program looked close to victory. Above all, 8 had been a technological triumph. During the flight, only 5 components out of 5 million had failed to work. Jim Lovell had played a key role throughout, and a landing on the moon was already planned for him. But it was not to be. Though Lovell didn't know it, later he was to star in a drama that would transfix the entire world. Two more successful missions paved the way for Apollo 11 and its date with destiny. By the summer of '69, NASA had chosen its crew. Their names would go into the history books: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. All of them in their early 30s, and unlike their public audience, they knew how dangerous a landing might prove to be. The launch would be the biggest crowd puller of all time, with over 1 million people turning up at Cape Kennedy for the greatest event in media history.
20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start.
As the entire world, it seemed, watched with bated breath, Apollo 11 drew closer to the moment of truth. As they headed for the moon, they were guided by the same stars that had led Magellan, Columbus, and Cook.
Without a doubt, as I look back on the achievements of Apollo, in particular on our mission, the first landing, the igniting of the engine and executing the powered descent to successfully transfer from being in orbit or being in a coasting flight to actually setting down on another planetary surface was a monumental accomplishment.
Earlier missions had tried out all the procedures: undocking the lunar module, firing the engine to take them down to the surface, firing it again to bring them back up. Only one procedure had not been tried: landing. Armstrong and Aldrin were to fly this fragile thing, the lunar module, with its structure no thicker than 3 sheets of kitchen foil, the last 50,000 feet down. If anything went wrong, there was nothing Collins, circling overhead in the command module, could do to help. And things went wrong. Inaccurate telemetry made it necessary for Armstrong to spend too much time looking for a landing spot. With only 17 seconds of fuel left, the question was, would they abort?
As we entered into the descent phase, we found that we were slightly downrange, and we didn't know whether we had a navigational error, some kind of procedural error, or something associated with undocking. Then we had the computer program alarms that we had to solve. And finally, as we got to the surface of the moon, we just about ran out of gas. Okay, all flight controllers, go for powered descent. Retro? Go. FIDO? Go. Guidance? Go. Control? Go. Telcom? Go. GNC? Go. ECOM? Go. Surgeon? Go. Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro? Go. FIDO? Go. Guidance? Go. Control? Go.
Everything's going well until suddenly the computer says it's overloaded and gives the alarm.
1201, roger, 1201 alarm. 1201 alarm. Same type, we're go, flight. Okay, we're go. Same type, we're go.
60 seconds.
Armstrong ignores the alarm and opts for a manual landing without the computer's help.
There were some very tense moments as the fuel quantity predictions were reaching that 60 seconds level.
11 forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet.
And a little bit it was 30 seconds, and I could see that we're in the final process of settling down, and it was very settling, calming to see the light come on, indicating that the probe that was on the landing gear had just touched the ground, and I knew that we were home free at that point, and it was just a question of making that last second final touchdown and then shutting the engine on.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
The first landing is the most exciting one. I think the people who came along in later missions appreciated just how tense and how precious those final drops of fuel were. So they were determined that they weren't going to get quite as close to the empty level in the later missions.
And Armstrong's words, as he stepped onto the lunar surface, went into the memory of every culture on Earth.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here.
In our control mission center, all people, congratulations! And after that, we will go to restaurant and drink some glass to health of this crew.
The nicest image that I have in my mind of the flight of Apollo 11 is that time when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were right in front of me in the lunar module, and then simultaneously the Earth popped up right behind them. When the Earth pops up over the lunar horizon, it always surprises you. I mean, even though you have a piece of paper that says it's scheduled to be there, nonetheless, when it first pops up, it comes as quite a surprise, so that I could say to myself, well, look, that's all there are. 3 billion people there and 2 people there, and that's all there are. I don't know why it took me 250,000 miles out to discover that fact, but you are pulled to it visually and spiritually.
The Apollo 11 crew came back to a hero's welcome. Nobody outside NASA knew how close to disaster they had come on that landing. Apollo 11 had been sold as the great adventure. So to a public fed on the theatrics of space, Apollo 12 looked like a second-rate rerun. Public interest dropped like a stone, and so did support for the missions. We'd gone to the moon, why go again? It looked as if NASA was losing public support fast. And then something happened to put them back on the front page. Apollo 13. On April the 11th, 1970, the crew of Apollo 13 suited up for what looked to be the least watched spaceflight of all time. The three men who were to shake everybody's complacent view of spaceflight to the core were Jim Lovell of the Apollo 8 flight, Fred Hayes on his first mission, and Jack Swigert, the only bachelor astronaut. All three men were experienced test pilots, used to taking risks, which, as it turned out, would be just as well. What the crew of Apollo 13 do not know, as the Saturn lifts off from Cape Kennedy at 13:13 hours local time, is that they're flying a time bomb. One vital piece of equipment has a fatal flaw. Apollo 13 is now 15 hours into a routine flight virtually ignored by the media, and Lovell and Hayes are 3 days away from joining the world's most exclusive club, the men who've walked on the moon. The crew has been drawing on oxygen tank 2 since the flight began, but what they and Mission Control do not know is that during a ground test prior to launch, a switch in the tank overloaded and fused, burning away the insulation on some electrical wiring. When the tank was filled, the wires were covered. It is now only a matter of time till the level of liquid oxygen in the tank drops enough to leave the bare wires exposed and ready to spark at the first use of the tank fans. Unaware of their problem, the crew reconfigures their spacecraft for the journey to the moon. They sit in the conical command module. It's at the top of the rocket. Attached to it is the cylindrical service module, which supplies the command module with propulsion and electrical power and houses the oxygen tanks. After turning around, the crew docks the command module to the spider-like lunar module, the LEM, and extracts it from the spent rocket's third stage. 31 hours into the flight of Apollo 13, the crew prepares for a course change. In order to explore a new part of the moon, Apollo 13 will deliberately leave the free return trajectory flown by all previous missions. After 55 hours and 50 minutes of flight, the wires in Tank 2 are now exposed. As the crew prepares to go to sleep, Mission Control radios up a routine request. Would they please turn on the fans in the oxygen tanks?
Jim was heading back into the command module, and we were going to do a little relook at checklists. This was my plan, and then ready everything and go to bed. Then we heard the bang.
The spacecraft rocked back and forth. I could hear the jets firing because we were on an autopilot that would stabilize the ship. And then everything was quiet.
You could actually hear, metallic bending noises in the tunnel area where the vehicles were still connected, but they were moving relative to each other to have caused that kind of a tin canning sound.
We looked at each other. What was it? We didn't know. I mean, nothing had come through the bulkhead. I mean, we didn't look like a meteorite hit the command module. Everything was still there. I looked at Fred, and, I could tell that Fred didn't do this, didn't do anything. And about that time, a red light had come on and said something to the fact that we had lost part of our electrical system, our main bus B.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. The
is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt.
Roger, main B undervolt. Okay, stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
This was what we would call, in our parlance, we'd call it a funny. It was something we didn't understand what had happened, and that is why the ground is down here. We would strip this data out, we'd look at it in recorders, we'd start figuring out what had caused the funny that we had seen.
There he goes again. Son of a gun.
Unfortunately, that funny starts to look more serious as warning lights flash on screens throughout the room. Watching one of those screens is Cy Liebergott. It's his job to monitor the spacecraft's electrical system, and he can't believe what he's seeing.
I looked at my screens, and when I looked at my screens, the data said to me on the electrical power system display that I had lost the voltage on main bus B, which is one of the two main buses that feed the spacecraft, and I had lost two fuel cells. I had lost fuel cells 1 and 2. I looked at my environmental control system cryogenics display of data, and it said I had lost O2 tank 2, and I was losing O2 tank 1. I'm looking at not a single failure, not a double failure, not a triple failure, but I'm looking at a quadruple failure. There's no possible way that could happen in this spacecraft the way it was designed.
As I looked back aft, I could see a gaseous substance escaping. It looks like a very thin haze at a very high rate of speed going out.
The main sense right then was I knew we lost a mission. We were going to board and not even go into lunar orbit, much less land.
Hatch, we are venting something.
Roger.
We are venting something out into space.
Roger, we copy your venting. Okay, let's everybody think of the kind of things we'd be venting. GNC, you got anything that looks abnormal in your system? Negative, Flight. How about you, Ecom? You see anything that could be venting?
Let me look at the system as far as the venting is concerned.
Okay, let's start scanning. Okay, now let's everybody keep cool. Let's solve the problem, but let's not make it any worse by guessing.
20 minutes into the crisis, Cy Liebergott comes to the conclusion that what's venting is the crew's source of oxygen. He accepts what his instruments have been telling him all along. Oxygen tank 2 is dead. 2 of Odyssey's 3 fuel cells are dead, and oxygen tank 1, which is keeping the last fuel cell and the crew alive, is dying.
Yeah. We'll have plenty reset it.
And that's when it hit. Without the electrical power, the command module was dead. Without the electrical power and without oxygen, the crew were dead. That's how we were. We were on the point of losing everybody and everything.
As the crisis deepens, the crew of Apollo 13's air supply starts to run out. They are 4/5 of the way to the moon, 200,000 miles away from the Earth, and they have only 14 minutes of air left. There's one small hope, the Lunar Excursion Module, the LEM. It has its own supplies of oxygen and electricity, enough to keep them alive for a while.
We found out that, that we'd probably lose all of our oxygen, knowing that we're also losing our propulsion system, plus our electricity, of course. We decided that the only way we are going to save ourselves is use the LEM as a lifeboat.
Lovell and Hayes scramble through the tunnel into the LEM. Time is short, and they must activate power, guidance, and life support.
Okay,
Back in the command module, Jack Swigert starts shutting things down. This will preserve the capsule's tiny entry batteries, which the crew will need if and when they get back to Earth, because the command module is the only part of the ship that can survive re-entry. Shutting it down now means it's going to get very cold, and that worries the team on the ground.
You did have a sense that this was the little home that it takes to get the folks back, and we were turning off all the lights. As a matter of fact, it was going to get very, very cold, and everything in it was going to be
refrigerator or freezer temperatures when we came back, and we didn't know what the effect of any of that was going to be on the hardware. For example, the guidance hardware that we would need when we got to the reentry portion of the flight.
Okay, I'm coming back to you.
3 hours into the crisis, Mission Control's focus shifts to the question of a course home. At this point, the most direct course may not be the best.
There were only two things really that you could do at that point. Being so close to the moon, you had to make up your mind, are we going to come back as rapidly as possible by using the engines on the command and service module or the lunar module? Or are we willing to take an extra 24 to 48 hours, let the thing be on a free return trajectory, let the moon bring us back from its gravitational pull, and can we keep the men alive safely for that length of time?
Turning around now is a high-risk strategy. It would get the crew home in 2 days, but it would use almost all the available fuel. Neither Krantz nor Lunny is willing to do that. They decide to go round the moon. It's a choice that has a lot of appeal to the astronauts.
At least we would be on a course that would intercept the Earth in some manner. Maybe not so much that it would be survivable, but it would probably be a much better aspect than being a permanent monument to the space program, you know, going back and forth for, I don't know, eons.
Okay, Aquarius, you're ready to copy P-30 maneuver pad. That's affirmed. Okay, here we go. The purpose is mid-course correction for free return. Down 33.
They wanted to do it in 37 minutes. We were a little bit more cautious up in the spacecraft. Don't forget, at the rate we are going now, the course that we were on was going to get us within 60 miles of the lunar surface. And you know, if we made the mistake of burning the wrong direction or a little bit like that, we could just plow right into the moon.
Lovell asks for and gets an extra hour to enter the data and prepare the ship. Then, at 2:45 on Tuesday morning, almost 6 hours after the accident, Apollo 13 takes its first step on the long journey home.
5 seconds before the burn, there's a little indication on the computer that says, do you really want to make this burn? The computer is asking us if we know what we're doing. I hit the proceed button, which says, okay, computer, you got it. At 0, the engine goes on. Everything's working fine. It automatically shuts down. So there was a little bit of a high for us. I mean, you know, everything's going wrong. The command module is completely dead. And finally, we know that at least the brains in the lunar module are working so far, and we do get on what we thought was the free return burn.
Though they're still moving away from the Earth, 13 is now on course for home. At its present speed, however, the astronauts will run out of power and water before they get back. With that in mind, Mission Control starts the complex preparations for a second, bigger burn to be made after 13's gone round behind the moon. The burn will cut 24 hours off the trip home, but that may not be enough. As the data from all the onboard systems, the tracking network and the computers on the ground add up, NASA realizes they're facing the unthinkable. 13 may not make it back. Now, for the first time, the nightmare scenario of men marooned in space becomes a grim reality. "24 hours after the accident, the crippled Apollo 13 approaches the moon. The vitally important Big Burn is now just 1 hour away. And because the lunar module has less computing power than an average car has today, all the calculations for the burn have to be done by Mission Control. Painstaking, detailed instructions are radioed up to the crew, who have to copy them precisely before they lose radio contact behind the moon.
As the ground started to write up these procedures, I looked at Fred and Jack, and they weren't even listening to these procedures, but they had their cameras broken out, and they were looking at shutter speeds and aperture settings, and we're looking back at the moon. And I asked those guys, what are your plans here, gentlemen? And they said, well, we're going to take pictures when we go around the far side.
We knew that was the only time we were going to ever get to see the moon. So we
kind of played tourist during that period.
As they swing around the moon, Hayes and Swigert are glued to the windows. 30 minutes later, Lovell fires the lunar module engine for the big burn. It's time to face the truth. The crew now has to power down every system in the spacecraft. The next 3 days will put both crew and equipment to the ultimate test.
We knew early in the game that the powered down levels would approach survival of the crew and the survival of the system. The systems would get so cold that we were worried that possibly the batteries might freeze, the propellant in the command and service module lines would freeze.
Without power, life in the lunar module becomes grim.
It gradually cooled on down to close to freezing in the command module, in some areas below freezing because the water tanks, for instance, froze. And I'd say 40 or slightly below in the LEM.
The tension and the cold make it almost impossible to sleep. And if that weren't enough, there are other problems for the crew. Houston asks them to stop dumping their urine overboard because the effect is altering 13's trajectory. The crisis on Apollo 13 is now into its second day. Hardly anybody back on Earth is unaware of the disaster and of the very real possibility that the 3 astronauts will die in space. Special prayers are offered from the Vatican to the Wailing Wall. Earlier on the 3rd day, NASA had recognized another life-threatening development: carbon dioxide accumulating in the lunar module. It may kill the crew. The problem is, the command module's square filters do not fit the round receptacles of the lunar module. Ground control has to find a solution that uses materials the crew has on board, like the cardboard covers from the flight manuals, plastic bags from the spacesuits, and lots of duct tape. By early Wednesday evening, they have a prototype. It takes a while to describe it to the crew up in space. It then takes the crew a tense 2 hours to find and assemble all the pieces. It's a flimsy-looking contraption, but it'll rid the cabin of CO2. The deadly problem is solved.
As soon as we put it together and hooked it up to the environmental system, the pressure went way down, and we knew that this thing had worked.
For the next 24 hours, the crew can do nothing to help themselves. All they can do is endure the cold and discomfort. Their concern with the storage of urine and the shortage of water has made them drink less and less. As a result, they're all dehydrated. Fred Hayes develops a bladder infection. By late Wednesday, he's deteriorating. By Thursday, he can hardly stop shivering.
And finally, it dawned on me that how sick he was. I ended up putting my body around, wrapped him around him to try to keep him warm because he was visibly shaking, with the chills.
2 days of cold and misery has the crew exhausted and drained. And Apollo 13 is still 24 hours away from the Earth. Those hours promise to be some of the most stressful of the entire flight.
You could almost feel them tailing off from a standpoint of their performance, but I never really understood how desperately cold it was out there and how those people were very close to freezing.
With 13 now so close to home, the time is fast approaching when the crew will have to get back into the frozen command module and try to restart it. But before they can do that, Mission Control has to work out a set of instructions, a checklist. A team led by 27-year-old John Aaron has spent the last 4 days working on the problem, trying to figure out how to start up the command module and how to prioritize use of the systems so as to make the limited onboard battery power last for the rest of the flight.
How do you go in with these little entry batteries, which are just designed to do 45 minutes worth of business, and do something that even our initial estimates has got to take 5 or 6 hours?
10 hours before projected splashdown, Aaron and his teams are still working on a detailed checklist that will tell the crew which switch to throw and when. They've checked and rechecked the computer simulations, and they're still not sure it'll work.
So I'm calling down and saying, I would certainly like to have that checklist up here because I knew it was going to be a very long thing and we're going to have to copy down and Swiker was going to have to be doing all this sort of stuff. And I wanted to maybe to get it up and maybe have a couple dry runs and, things like that. And of course, by this time they're having a lot more confidence in our survival, which I thought was kind of nice. And they said they'd have it up by Saturday. We were going to be back there by Friday.
At 4 o'clock on Friday morning, the command module startup checklist is finally ready. Apollo 13 is now less than 9 hours from re-entry, hurtling towards the Earth at 20,000 miles an hour. It takes Jack Swigert 2 hours and 40,000 miles to write down all the detailed instructions. He uses every scrap of paper the crew can find on board. 6 hours before re-entry, Swigert climbs back into the command module and starts throwing switches. Even now, nobody knows whether it'll power up.
We had froze that mothership for, 4 days beyond its design limits because it wasn't meant to be frozen, turned off and frozen, literally. So there was still, in my mind, concern about the condition of the capsule. It ain't over, it's over.
Everything the crew has worked for during the past 2 days hangs on this moment. Will it start up, or have the freezing temperatures taken their toll on the equipment? To everybody's intense relief, the command module flickers back to life, and for the first time there's a real chance they'll make it back to Earth. But there's no time to celebrate. Every second counts. The crew is cold and exhausted. Hayes's fever is worse. But at this point, adrenaline takes over.
It was the big ball game sort of sense, and I was ready to do what I had to do. When you're in that situation, you don't sense your own condition.
First, the crew has to get rid of the dead service module. Lovell and Hayes are still in the lunar module. Lovell's real concern is that his less experienced command module pilot may jettison the wrong part of the spacecraft.
I'm in the lunar module with a camera, and I tell Jack, not once, not twice, but 3 times, I said, Jack, we're jettisoning the service module, not the lunar module. Don't jettison the lunar module. Put some tape over that switch.
Once the service module is separated, the crew will get their first and only chance to see what had really happened to it.
He jettisons the service module, then I pull the command module and the lunar module together away, and then maneuver a little bit to see if I can see this service module as it sort of just drifts away from us. And sure enough, it comes into view, and as it rotates very slowly, one whole side of that panel was blown off.
Right by the high gate antenna, the whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine.
Copy that.
It's really a mess. Man, that's unbelievable.
We were actually sort of excited to see this thing, to find out, to give us some evidence of what really went wrong. Because you always have that thing in the back of your mind, well, gee, maybe, did I screw up someplace along the line to cause this all to happen? I mean, you have to bring home some evidence saying, hey, really, folks, it wasn't my fault. Take a look at this picture. Something happened back there and I wasn't back there.
Knowing how much damage has been done to the service module leaves everybody in mission control with the same thought. Is 13's heat shield, inches away from the explosion, still intact?
Any penetration of the heat shield would have very possibly allowed a heat leak, plasma leak, and eventually a burn through during the process of entry. There wasn't anything about this entire mission that was a free ride.
Re-entry is now 50 minutes away. It's time for Lovell and Hayes to leave the tiny lunar module that's been their life support for the past 2 days. They join Swigert in the command module, lock the tunnel behind them, and wait for the order to jettison the LEM.
Okay for jettison.
Left jettison.
Okay, copy that. Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
She sure was a good ship.
The command module is now on its own.
I know all of us here want to thank all you guys down there for the very fine job you did. That's the firm, Joe.
Tell you, we all had a good time doing it.
You have a good bedside manner.
That's the nicest thing anybody's ever said.
Sorry.
"13 is traveling at 24,000 miles an hour when it hits the Earth's atmosphere. 19 seconds later, radio contact is lost as the craft is enveloped in flame. Blackout is expected to last 3 minutes.
Blackout is one of those times when there's nothing we can do, and seconds become minutes, and minutes become hours, and if you haven't heard, boy, it gets you right in the stomach.
Then came the sight of Apollo 13's parachutes through the clouds. Against all the odds, the astronauts had returned from the dead.
You're absolutely uptight, tense, on the edge for 4 days, and then to see that wonderful sight of the vehicle lumbering down through the atmosphere, hanging on chutes. It's just, well, I'll never forget it.
It was an emotional moment for everybody, especially Gene Kranz.
About the time that you see chutes, you'll see the cheering and the American flags come out. And then it's again tradition that you wait until the crew gets in the carrier deck, at which time cigars and the world map lights up. And shit. It was neat.
Guys have worked hard. Guys worked hard to bring this one home.
Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert never got another chance to walk on the moon. But 8 other Americans made the journey to the lunar surface. The last Apollo left the moon 20 years ago, and it is unlikely that we will find a good reason to return there again in our lifetime. So, in one sense, was it a pointless and political exercise? Many scientists would say yes. But we did learn one thing. The Apollo missions accomplished something fundamentally important for humanity. By traveling to the moon, the astronauts gave us the chance to look back at ourselves from outer space and to realize how vital it is to preserve and protect our own fragile planetary spacecraft, the Earth. Because unlike Jim Lovell, we have no backup.